Please join me in welcoming Deputy Consul Shahar Arieli.
Thank you for joining to this Mythbusters workshop. The myth that I would like to address has to do with the changes that took place in the Middle East in the past decades. And I would try to claim that this is a changing Middle East that we are dealing with. And it is important to understand those changes if we want to get a better grasp of what is happening in the Middle East and, of course, in Israel. And what is the nature of these changes that take place in the Middle East? Well, for sure, for some people, they will claim that there are no changes in the Middle East because the Middle East was a source of trouble then, and it will continue to be a source of trouble. And you know what? They might not be wrong. For sure, there are some elements in the Middle East that never change. For example, it's hot in the Middle East. It was hot and it will remain hot. I don't see no changes there. Something else that doesn't change is that the Middle East have oil. That too is here to remain. And I would take these three components, that it's a hot place in more aspects than one. It has oil, and maybe because of those two elements, it is a source for trouble. And there are no changes there. But some things do change, and I want to speak about the myth of the Middle Eastern conflict. That is something that we did see some serious changes about. And first, so this is the myth that I will address, the myth of the Middle Eastern conflict. And what is the Middle Eastern conflict? I thought about how to address this issue, and what I thought can be the best approach is to enjoy the 21st century. And since I got this 4G cellular phone just yesterday, I thought about using it. So I Googled, in this, would you believe, I Googled Middle East conflict. And what were the results that I got? So out of the first 8 results to the words Middle Eastern conflict, I got 4 that dealt with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, including number 1 and number 3. And as we all know very well, in many of the newspapers, in media, and so on, when we hear the word Middle East conflict, what they really mean is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think you cannot be further away from the truth. This is not the real conflict in the Middle East. And if you want to understand the Middle East, we must understand the real conflict in the Middle East. And I'm not saying that there is no Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There is, of course there is, and we have to solve it. But we have to know better. So, again, what is the real conflict in the Middle East? I could do some analyzing and deal with political changes and show you and so on. But again, I'm taking a Google-based approach here. So I thought about doing something very grim, actually, and maybe morbid, but I think it proves the point. So I thought about just measuring the number of casualties in the different conflicts that took place in the Middle East in the past decades, and see what number of casualties we have in conflicts which are not related at all to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and compare that with the number of casualties in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and that will give us a clue as to the question of, is this really the Middle Eastern conflict? So let's take a quick look. And my source, by the way, was more reliable than the Encyclopedia Britannica. It was Wikipedia. So Wikipedia on the number of casualties in conflicts in the Middle East. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, 8,000 casualties since the very start, which is for sure, it's not a small number. but let's do some comparative work. The war in Afghanistan. Since the Soviet invasion, 1 million casualties. Since the war the US was involved in, a total of 70,000 casualties, and this is according to the most conservative estimations. There are higher. The civil war in Algeria that started in 1991. The most conservative estimation is 200,000. The war between Iran and Iraq. Estimations between 500,000 to 1 million. Now, Darfur is on the margins of the Middle East, but it is on the margins of the Middle East, and we have a conflict there between the Central Arab government and the Christian minority, the black Christian minority in the southern Sudan. We there have a genocide, and the lowest estimation is 300,000. I could go on with numbers and numbers, but you know what? Let's just take a look at the events of Black September in Jordan. Then you had basically Jordanian soldiers killing Palestinians because the Palestinians tried to take over the country. It doesn't matter. But these are casualties of Palestinians in Jordan. And the estimations, according to Yasser Arafat at the time, was between 10,000 and 20,000. So, according to the most conservative estimations, the casualties of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are less than 0.5% of the total number of casualties in other conflicts which are completely not related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the Middle East. Less than 0.5%. And now let's get to the question of the real conflict in the Middle East. And this conflict is present in all of those wars. All of those conflicts which cause hundreds of thousands of casualties. And this is, of course, the conflict between radical Islam, which is trying to take over state by state, combating different forces at every time. The conflict between radical Islam and the other forces that basically want to preserve the situation the way it is. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the real conflict in the Middle East. So if we take a look at all these wars, Afghanistan, okay, no need to explain there. The Mujahideen that fought the Soviets, they were, of course, radical Islam. Osama bin Laden was there. That's where he got his training. Civil war in Algeria against the Islamists, against the central government. The war between Iran and Iraq, okay, no need to explain further. Darfur, again, a war which is based on religion. The Muslim government killing the black Christians on religion and on ethnicity, because it's also Arabs against black people. I think this point is well proven. Why is that important? Why is that important at all to understand? Well, first of all, if we are interested in the Middle East and understanding it, I would say that the results of the real conflict will determine where the Middle East is going to. And ladies and gentlemen, it's not going in a good direction. Because if we see what is happening in Lebanon, with the Hezbollah actually taking over, I mean, the Hezbollah was always the most powerful element in Lebanon, or at least it's been so for the last decade. But now they are officially or semi-officially running the government. In Gaza, we know Hamas took over radical Islam. We know that the first free elections in the Arab world were done in the Palestinian Authority, 2006, and we know the results. Hamas took over. Iran, we know what is happening in Iran. This is the country that leads radical Islam in the Middle East. And of course, the question of Egypt. Right now, I don't want to predict what will happen. We know that ever since the collapse of the second temple, they say that prophecy was given to fools. So I don't want to be a fool and make prophecies. But basically, nobody knows which direction Egypt is going to. And the Muslim Brotherhood, for sure, will have more influence. And if anybody had other thoughts, let me be very clear about that. The Muslim Brotherhood is not some kind of a fraternity in some college, right? This is a radical movement. The deputy of Osama bin Laden got his training in the Muslim Brotherhood. Actually, the main ideologist behind that sponsored Al-Qaeda, Sayyid Qutb, was part of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is the mother organization of Hamas, and so on. But why is that important to Israel to understand the nature of the real conflict in the Middle East? It is important for Israel because many times this myth of the Israel-Palestinian conflict being the real conflict of the Middle East, and this myth that if Israel and the Palestinians solve the conflict between them, that will steer the Middle East to a whole new direction. This myth is being used to put, in basic terms, to put political pressure on Israel, so that Israel will pay in an Israeli coin, in an Israeli currency, so to speak, in order to solve the Middle East problems. And this is all wrong. We are too small, our shoulders are too narrow, we can't carry the weight of the Middle East on our back. And solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, while a good purpose for sure, that will change nothing in the big game. And the big game is between radical Islam and its enemies. And don't get me wrong, we do want to solve the conflict with the Palestinians, but we want to solve that because it is in our interest, not because we can change the reality of the Middle East. And I think current events in Egypt show how fragile is the support to U.S. interests in other countries of the Middle East. The U.S. put so much investment into Egypt. And look how fragile everything is. In one day, a revolution, and nobody knows what happens next. Nobody knows. I don't want to make predictions, but we all remember what happened in Iran. The only country on which the U.S. can really rely on in the Middle East is Israel. Because Israel is a democracy, because support to the U.S. in Israel is genuine, it comes from the people. I don't know how many of you were in Israel during our Independence Day, but if you have, maybe you saw an interesting phenomenon. On cars, you could see flags, of course, of Israel during our Independence Day, but sometimes you could see the flag of Israel, and alongside of it, you see the American flag. And that is because, to put it bluntly, we like the U.S. We have shared values with the U.S. Not so the situation in all of our neighbors. So to claim that Israel is harming American interests because we cannot solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will improve the situation of American interests in the Middle East, that is, ladies and gentlemen, that is completely wrong. If we want to promote U.S. interests in the Middle East, we have to keep Israel strong. Because when push comes to shove, the only country that the U.S. can rely on in the Middle East is Israel. Basically, I was told to keep it under 17 minutes. I think I did a good job. I don't even see the sign. Oh, 1 minute left. So there were signs, I just didn't see. Okay, great timing. So since I understand we are keeping questions to the end, looks like it's your turn. Thank you.
We will try to leave a few minutes at the end of the session for questions for both Shahar and for Brett. So I'd like to introduce Brett Cohen, who is director of the Chicago chapter and Midwest region of Stand With Us, an international educational organization to ensure that Israel's side of the story is heard. Brett graduated from Loyola University Chicago in 2008, where he majored in political science, international studies, and anthropology. I hope not all at the same time. Brett has been a member of the Stand With Us team for 3 years and is currently director of the Chicago chapter. Beyond Israel education, Brett has been involved with GLBT right issues and other human rights causes. So please welcome Brett Cohen from Stand With Us.
very much for having me. I'm really excited to be here, and I've actually been here all weekend, and it's been a really amazing program. I'm going to speak a little quickly, because I have a lot of material to cover and a very short time to do it. So today we're talking about myths and facts in Israel, and specifically I'm going to cover apartheid, BDS, which is the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanction movement, and history through maps. So I think the best thing to do is to start with history through maps. By show of hands, who here has seen this map before? Has anyone? So this is a map that's produced by an anti-Israel organization called If Americans Knew, which basically advocates the dissolution of the State of Israel as an injustice and its replacement with a Palestinian Arab state. What you see in this map is essentially a very interesting take on history. The white segments towards the left are JNF-held territory before 1948. And the green section, which they are claiming it was all Palestinian Arab held, in reality, the majority of that land was state-owned land through the British Mandate, and before that through the Ottoman Empire. So just to illustrate a point, the Middle East, when we talk about the different countries that are there, is a relatively young region. Most of the countries gained independence along the same time that Israel did. And as we can see, Israel's neighbors, Jordan, 1946, Syria, 1945, Lebanon in 1943, it's all around the same area that this entire region was carved up and created into different nation states. This is a map of what we call historic Palestine. The Ottoman Empire held the longest stretch of control over the land in modern history. And as you can see in the yellow area that has slashes through it, you can see the first Judean kingdom from the 1st century BC. What's interesting is that Palestine, under the Ottoman Empire, actually was never a sovereign territory. It was part of Syria. And the Arabs who lived there at the time considered themselves part of southern Syria. The area that today makes up Israel and the Palestinian territories was split into 3 regions, with the regional head in the Mustafariya of Jerusalem. So as we can see, the notion that Palestine was a country that existed and was independent throughout the ages and had a continuous territory is not exactly correct. Throughout the colonial period, after World War I, at the fall of the Ottoman Empire, when the British and the French moved in to split up the Middle East, we see that Palestine actually included today what is Israel, Jordan, parts of Lebanon, and parts of Syria. The Golan Heights actually were part of Palestine until the British traded it with the French in 1917. So then in 1922, the British split the Palestinian Mandate into 1/3 and 2/3. 1/3 maintaining to be Palestine, and the 2/3 of the territory went to Transjordan, which was basically a transplant of an Arabian king who was deposed by the Saudi family. So the Hashemite king in Jordan is actually a foreign ruler from Saudi Arabia, but you don't hear that a lot. So this brings us to the UN partition plan. We have the British Mandate coming to an end. The British Mandate, by the way, was to set up a Jewish national home in the land of Israel without infringing any rights of any indigenous Arabs. So the UN decides to get involved, split the land in 1947. The partition, which you see on the left, was rejected by the Arab leadership. It was accepted by the World Zionist Congress. And as we all know, May 14th, 1948, Israel is declared a state, and it's immediately attacked by the 5 surrounding countries: Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon and Egypt. So then we get to the panel on the right, which is the outcome of the war in 1948, which also are known as the 1967 borders. In reality, they are armistice lines. Then we get to 1967. So 1967 was really a monumental year. Israel won a war that it initiated the war that was being started by its enemies, by the buildup in the Sinai of the Egyptian military and the cables that it had received from Syria and Jordan. And Israel captured a significant amount of territory that was much more than what the state had actually had in the beginning. And it immediately, at the day after the war, offered to return all of the territory it captured for a peace agreement. This was, of course, rejected by the Arab states and led to the situation that we have today. On the right-hand panel, you see the basic makeup of what happened. So the Sinai was returned to the Egyptians in the 1979 peace treaty. Israel withdrew from the territory it took in Lebanon in the north in 2000, and it unilaterally withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005. And today, the West Bank is currently disputed territory. While there is an occupation in the West Bank of the Palestinian people, the land itself is technically disputed territory. It does not have a single claim to sovereignty. When Jordan, after the 1967 war, pulled out of the West Bank territory, they seceded their sovereignty to it, which means that there isn't a single country on earth today that has a claim to the West Bank except for Israel and the nascent Palestinian state, which will be emerging soon. So, the West Bank, just to talk a little bit about this and some of the issues that are involved here. You often hear a lot about Israel's illegal settlements. There is no international law that says that Israeli settlements are indeed illegal. In fact, they might be politically unwise, which is probably the worst thing you can say about them, but the matter of fact is that they are not illegal settlements. Israel captured a territory that it won in a defensive war, and, quite frankly, has a legitimate claim to the land. The West Bank, which is the modern political name, is made up of Judea, which is everything south of Jerusalem, and Samaria, which is everything that's north of Jerusalem. This is the cradle of Jewish civilization. And when the Israeli government and Israelis talk about making painful concessions for peace, this is exactly what they're talking about. The West Bank territory is where the ancient kingdom of Israel really had its high point. It's where Shechem, the first capital, was, most of Jerusalem, Hebron. It's really where the patriarchs of the Jewish people walked. And what's interesting is that when you look and compare an ancient map from the biblical period to today, everything's inverted. Because Philistia, where the Philistines lived, was on the coast where Gaza is, going up to Ashdod. And they were also in the north as well, and realistically the Judean kingdom was in today's, what is the West Bank. So on the right here, you see a panel of the settlements in the West Bank and the proposed and already built border areas. And what we can see is, just if you can, I'll see my mouse here, is that the majority of the settlements are actually located right in this area here. And when we're talking about territorial compromise, it would essentially, you'd be able to get most of the settlers into a state and be able to swap territory with the Palestinians for a contiguous land. But the reason that this is such an important issue is because the West Bank sits on is a mountain ridge that essentially overlooks the coastal plain where the vast majority of the Israeli population lives. So if, for example, there is a Palestinian state, and that state is taken over by Hamas, and then you have Iran sitting on the mountain ridges looking down on Tel Aviv, that's not exactly a very secure situation. In fact, in some places, the border would be less than 9 miles wide, which is practically indefensible. So we hear a lot about the different maps that were drawn up during the peace negotiations. On the Palestinian side, after the Camp David agreement was walked away from, they claimed that the Israelis were trying to split up their territory into 3 little statelets, which in fact has been disputed by President Clinton, who said that Arafat lied. What we see is the map on the left is what the Palestinians claimed Israel offered them, and the map on the right is what the U.S. State Department has confirmed was the offer that was on the table in 2000. That was walked away from and then launched into the Second Intifada. So getting into our next myth is that Israel is an apartheid state. These are some samples of the posters that we see on college campuses. It's pretty ugly stuff. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about what apartheid was. Apartheid in South Africa was a legal system of discrimination against a 20% white minority against an 80% black majority. What happened in 1948 in South Africa was that the National Party, which was the white party, ran and won the election, and they began institutionalizing apartheid. Comparing that with Israel's founding, Israel was declared statehood based on a legal system of equal rights and civil protection for all citizens. In fact, from the Declaration of Establishment of the State of Israel, we see it says, Israel will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. And Israel urges Arab citizens to fully participate in building a new country. At the founding of the state, Israel had about a 10% Arab minority, which today has grown into a 20% Arab minority within the 1948 boundaries. To compare political rights, in South Africa's 80% non-white majority had to fight against brutal oppression to regain their citizenship and voting rights. When we contrast that to Israeli democracy, Israel's 20% non-Jewish minority has complete political rights. The Arab Israelis were elected to the first Knesset, and they've been in every Knesset since then. And Arab Israelis hold important positions in government. In the courts, there's an Israeli Arab member of the Supreme Court. There are several Arabs operating in Israeli consulates around the world and embassies around the world. And there's lots of Arabs who are in high ranks in the Israeli military. To talk about civil rights in South Africa, this was enforced segregation. And it's very akin to what we saw in the South in the United States. So by law, South Africans of color were segregated in every aspect of life except for the churches. So what you see in South Africa was you had black and white drinking fountains, you had different schools, you had different buses, everything you can imagine from the antebellum South. Compare that to Israel. Israel is an open society from people from all over the world, and there's equality, and there's religious institutions are protected. When we talk about ideology, in South Africa, it was racial ideology. Whites here, blacks here. You can see this is a picture from a beach in Durban. This is a picture from a sports arena where you see very clearly the stadium is segregated racially. I don't think you could ever imagine seeing something like that in Israel, by the way, if it was a sign that says Jews only, Arabs only. In Israel, there is complete inclusiveness. We've had Israeli, Arab, Miss Israel. There were Israeli athletes in the Maccabi game. Israeli athletes in the Maccabi games. There's been Arabs and all aspects of Israeli life. And now let's talk about the Palestinian population, because that's where things start to get tricky. It's very important to understand something. Palestinians do not want to be citizens of Israel. They have their own separate national movement, and they want their own independent state. So when we're talking about a country's right to define who is allowed to be a citizen and who it will take into its borders, as a sovereign state, Israel has a right to determine whether or not Palestinian Arabs who do not want to be Israeli citizens and who are not currently Israeli citizens can enter into Israeli territory that was held before 1967. We talk about the wall. On campus, it's referred to as the Apartheid wall. Realistically, the security wall was a response to the Second Intifada. The Palestinians rejected the Camp David Accords in 2000. In 2001, they launched the Intifada. Over 1,000 Israelis were murdered before they decided to build a wall. And today, the only terrorism that happens in Israel comes from the rockets falling from Gaza. So the wall has been a great success, and it's separated the two different national groups, because you have Palestinians and Israelis who don't want anything to do with each other at this point. Like J.J. Goldberg, the main speaker at this event yesterday, made a really funny comment. He said that we need to stop talking about a new Middle East, it's going to be a marriage. No, what we're talking about is a divorce, and the two parties really want to be divorced. So the separation barrier has helped to save lives on both sides of the fence, and it's a necessary component to ensure the security of Israeli civilians. And by the way, in apartheid South Africa, there were no physical barriers. Black people were just questioned everywhere they went and had to present papers and had to go through hoops, just kind of like in the antebellum South, but they weren't locked into small communities, they actually had full, complete range of motion throughout their country. Another very important point to make when we're comparing South Africa and Israel is that the South African black people didn't have their own representation in the National Council, and they didn't have any sort of auto-government. The Palestinians, under the Oslo Accords, which were signed in 1993, actually have the Palestinian Authority, which is their own government, in the areas that they control within the West Bank and Gaza. Well, I mean, they don't control Gaza anymore, but when they did, and Hamas does today, they have complete parliaments, they have complete power over all of the utilities and the daily life of their citizens. They have their own economic missions, they have their own embassies and different consulates or what have you in various countries that recognize them. And they really have their own independent government that governs their daily lives. The Israelis are not governing Palestinians' lives day to day. That's being done by the Palestinian Authority. It was the opposite in South Africa. You had the white minority governing every aspect of life for the black majority in South Africa. And I have 1 minute left, so I'd like to briefly talk about the BDS movement. The BDS movement is basically calling for the annihilation of the Jewish state. These are some of the pictures we've seen. There's three main types of movements. There's the cultural boycott, which urges performers not to go to Israel and to try to have international film festivals ban Israeli artists. There's economic boycotts who threaten to attack companies who do business with Israel. And then there's the academic boycott. The academic boycott is looking to have institutions divest in investments they have in Israel, to not allow Israeli professors to come and visit the university, and to not allow students to go to Israel to study abroad. What's so vicious about this movement is that they are actually anti-coexistence. The organizers, Omer Barghouti, who ironically is a graduate student at Tel Aviv University, and Ali Abu Nima, who is the founder of the website Electronic Intifada, which is basically a propaganda warehouse, actively campaign against a negotiated peace. They are in favor of a one-state solution that will annihilate the Jewish state by demographics. The boycotts, and this is my time, unfortunately, boycotts are destructive. We should stand against them. Thank you.
Turn the mic over to Brett and to Shahar, and take your questions.
Who's first? Yes, ma'am.
So how serious is the boycott US?
So the good thing is that the BDS movement actually has had very limited success as far in real terms of actually passing boycotts of Israel. You can count on one hand the amount of successes they've had. However, the real purpose of the movement isn't to have organizations actually boycott Israel because they know that it's not going to happen. The real program is to demonize Israel as an apartheid state, and unfortunately they've had a lot of success with that, especially on university campuses. Yes?
The West Bank Palestinians should have Jordanian citizenship, don't they?
Well, a lot of Palestinians in the West Bank do indeed have Jordanian citizenship, and Jordan, by the way, is 70% ethnically Palestinian. And also, I don't know if many of you saw in the news, but Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the PA, his entire family and his cabinet all just received Jordanian passports this week. So that's a very interesting development that it should be looked into. Do you have any comments on that?
On this question, actually, I want to say something about one of your slides about the settlements. If we can come back to,
Sure.
Because I think there is another point which should be made. Okay, so Brett gave some very interesting remarks, and I wanted to add one thing which I think is important, because when we are dealing with the question of are the settlements legitimate? The justification for the settlements is not only the historical justification, which is important, because we had a state there 3,000 years ago. And with all due respect, the Palestinians are an invention of the 20th century. And if anyone differs to that, please remind me when was the last Palestinian leader or king or whatever that anybody heard of before the 20th century. But our justification is not just in historical terms, it is in legal terms. Because if we go back to the Balfour Declaration, it said clearly that Jews has the right to build and settle throughout the land, and the land was starting from the Jordan River to the east and until the Mediterranean Sea to the west. And the Balfour Declaration, now stay with me because it's a legal argument, but it is an important one. The Balfour Declaration was incorporated into the decisions of the League of Nations, which was the organization that preceded the UN. So it is part of the mandate of the League of Nations that Jews have the right to settle throughout the land. And the UN, which was established after World War II, incorporated into its basic charter the decisions of the League of Nations. So in the very basic documents that defines the UN, we have the justification for Jews to build throughout the land, including in the West Bank. And there is another argument. The argument is what can be called the law of succession. Brett said, justifiably so, that no state can claim today ownership of the West Bank. The thing is that the last legitimate rule over the West Bank and over the entire land of Israel was the British Empire under the Mandate. When the Brits left the country, we entered a civil war, and out of this civil war, and later it was the war between Israel and the Arab countries, emerged one political entity, which is the State of Israel. So under the law of succession in international law, new entity that emerges inherits the rights of the previous one. For example, in the land of the Soviet Union, the new countries that were formulated, like Russia and Ukraine and the others, inherited the rights to the land that the Soviet Union had formerly. So after the war of 1948, we had the state of Israel, basically in this territory. We had Jordan occupying illegally. It was never recognized by the majority of the world countries. We had Jordan in the West Bank, and like Brett mentioned, Jordan later seceded its ownership for the West Bank. So out of the law of succession, the only entity that inherited the rights to this land is the State of Israel. So we have very strong legal arguments why the settlements are legal. And like Brett said, there are political issues. We know that we will have to give up on a large proportion of the land to make peace, and we want that. But we shouldn't make the mistake to think that the settlements are illegal. They are legal, and every action that Israel does is taken after a very serious legal consideration. And if you need more information on that, it appears on the website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you.
Is there anything subsequent to that legal history other than peace agreements or peace proposals, excuse me?
In what terms?
Is there anything that goes beyond the history you just mentioned relative to any other legal arguments that are more current?
There are the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords, unlike what many believe, are still valid. Because like any legal deal, nobody canceled them. Although of the events of the Second Intifada and so on. And according, the Oslo Accords do not dictate the outcome, but they do dictate that all the decisions regarding the West Bank will be taken through negotiations. So they don't predict the outcome, but they do predict the way to go in order to create the Palestinian state. Yes?
I just wanted to talk more about your thesis that radical Islam is really what's driving things in the Middle East. It was my understanding that Iraq started the Iraq-Iran war.
A good point.
And that had nothing to do with radical Islam other than, I mean, I understand Iran was radical by that point, but that's not why Iraq started the war.
A good point.
And in Sudan, the same thing, that's much more about old hatreds than it is really about radical Islam trying to take over that.
Okay, let me explain. Radical Islam, I didn't say that it was behind all the conflict. I said that it is present. It is present, significantly present, in all of those conflicts. Iraq would not have invaded Iran if Iran hadn't gone through the Islamic Revolution. And the Islamic ideas and the Islamic fundamental thinking was a major factor in the fact that the Iranian war went on for 8 years with million casualties. The Iranian, the motivation, the fact that they threw hundreds and thousands of children to the battlefield, they could not have done that without the Islamic motivation.
And on the Iran-Iraq war, one of the issues that were involved in why Saddam Hussein launched the war was because Iran was making entreaties to Iraq's Shia population, and he was worried about a civil war that was going to be started by the mullahs. So it was, I guess, some sort of preemptive war in his eyes to maintain the balance of his country, to not have Iran take over all of the Shia region of eastern Iraq.
So just one more comment. What do you think about the idea that that the appeal of radical Islam is driven further among populations by the fact that they feel oppressed in other
Do they feel
countries?
oppressed?
The population in general feels that they are oppressed and don't have rights, and so that radical Islam, rightly or wrongly, has an appeal that somehow that.
I mean, I would agree with that. They suffer under dictators. Unfortunately, that's really not Israel's problem. I mean, when the problem that I see is that Israel is blamed for the domestic issues that these poor people are suffering under. But in reality, these dictators manipulate the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to blame Israel to sidetrack away from the problems that they're oppressing their own people.
I'm sorry, I do need to interrupt at this point. So thank you, Brett and Shahar. I'm sorry. My name is difficult to pronounce for Israelis, so thank you very much.